In 1863, a Union cavalry officer named Major William Whitman stood in a field outside Loudoun County, Virginia, and made a decision that would alter the geological record of American history. He ordered the soil tested, not for bodies, not for artifacts, but for chemical composition, the lingering trace elements left behind by something the medical corps couldn't explain. What they found that autumn shouldn't have been possible, and the records were filed away so quietly that it took a geologist in 2019 digging through Virginia State Archives to even realize the tests had happened at all. This is not a story about what happened on a battlefield. It's about what happened to the ground itself, and why the very people who fought there believed something had fundamentally changed the soil beneath their feet. Welcome back to Hollow Ground. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the strangest suppressed geological mysteries in Civil War history, the case of the Whitman Field surveys, the unexplained soil anomalies that forced Union commanders to impose restrictions on entire sections of formerly active battlefields, and the question that historians have quietly avoided for over a century and a half. What was in the ground that made them want to keep people away? The context here is essential. By late 1863, the war had settled into a grinding pattern of movement and occupation across northern Virginia. The landscape had become a patchwork of strategic positions, supply routes, and contested ground where armies passed, repassed, and often left behind something more than just footprints and memories. Loudoun County, specifically, had become a zone of intense cavalry activity. Mosby's Rangers, Confederate guerrillas operating under Colonel John Singleton Mosby, controlled vast sections of the landscape through intimidation and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Union forces responded with increasingly aggressive reconnaissance missions, not just to locate the enemy, but to survey and understand the physical environment itself. Major Whitman's unit, part of the 2nd Cavalry Division, had been tasked with a dual mission: identify supply caches and gather military intelligence. But between September and November 1863, something shifted. The orders changed. Suddenly, Whitman's unit wasn't just surveying the land for tactical advantage, they were surveying it for something else entirely. The soldiers themselves noticed first. In the official regimental logs, documents that survived because they were considered routine administrative records and thus never heavily censored, there are entries from late September that mention unnatural discoloration in fields near what's now called Goose Creek. The entries are brief, almost dismissive, written in the clipped military language of the era, but the pattern is unmistakable. Soil appears darkened beyond expected range. Vegetation in eastern perimeter shows irregular browning, cause unclear. Men report metallic taste in water drawn from creek southeast quadrant, ordered cessation of water collection from this location. These aren't the observations you'd expect from a unit focused on military strategy. These are the observations of soldiers noticing that something was wrong with the land itself. What made Whitman take action, however, wasn't the soldiers' anecdotal reports. It was the incident with the horses. On October 3rd, 1863, a foraging detail from Whitman's unit had secured 17 cavalry mounts in a meadow just north of Snickers Gap. It was standard practice. Horses needed pasture, and this section of Loudoun County had open grassland relatively protected from Confederate patrols. The detail was supposed to be routine. By morning, 14 of the 17 horses were dead. The veterinarian attached to the regiment, a man named Dr. Samuel Ashford, whose personal letters survive in the Library of Congress, wrote that he had never encountered a toxicological event affecting animals on that scale and with that specific symptom profile. The horses exhibited severe neurological distress before death, trembling, violent convulsions, a kind of frantic agitation that he described as unnatural and distressing to witness. The soil was tested after that. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to trace, because the documentation was deliberately fragmented. Whitman didn't send the soil samples to a standard Army quartermaster lab. Instead, he reached out directly to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, specifically to a chemist named Charles Weatherby, who had been conducting agricultural analysis for the War Department. The correspondence, which took me nearly 4 years to locate in fragmented collections at the National Archives, shows that Whitman understood he had found something that fell outside the normal chain of military reporting. Weatherby's initial response, dated October 14, 1863, is cautious but clear. "I will undertake the analysis you have requested, though I must note that your description of the phenomenon exceeds the bounds of standard agricultural contamination. I will proceed with discretion." What Weatherby actually found remains only partially documented. The full analysis was never formally published, and Weatherby's correspondence with Whitman abruptly stops in December 1863. But Weatherby's notes, fragments discovered in 2019 by historian Dr. Eleanor Voss of the University of Virginia, mention the presence of elevated levels of heavy metals, specifically compounds of arsenic and mercury, far beyond what would occur naturally in Virginia soil. The concentration was so high that Weatherby explicitly noted it couldn't have resulted from normal agricultural or geological processes. Someone or something had introduced those metals into the ground systematically and in massive quantities. Now, this is where historical interpretation becomes crucial, and this is also where the official narrative, if one even existed, stops almost entirely. There are two possibilities that emerge from the available evidence. The first, and the one that Whitman's military superiors seemed to prefer, was that Confederate forces operating in the region had deliberately poisoned sections of the landscape to deny resources to Union troops. It was a known tactic in certain areas, contaminating water supplies, destroying crops, making the land itself hostile to occupation. But Weatherby's notes suggest something different. The distribution of the heavy metals wasn't consistent with intentional poisoning. It wasn't concentrated near water sources, which would have been the logical target for a sabotage operation. Instead, the highest concentrations appeared in specific geographic patterns that Weatherby described, cryptically, as following a line of previous disturbance. What that disturbance was, Weatherby didn't specify, but the implication is clear. The poisoning wasn't recent, it was old. By November 1863, Whitman's unit had relocated to different territory entirely. The move was officially classified as a strategic repositioning to support a larger cavalry operation. But the timing, immediately after the soil analysis came back with those troubling results, suggests that the decision was made at a higher level of command, based on what the analysis had revealed. What's remarkable is that no one tried to hide what happened. The incident with the horses was documented. The soil testing was documented, the results were filed away. But no grand cover-up, no official denial, no deliberate falsification of records. Instead, what happened was something far more subtle and far more effective. The information was simply compartmentalized. Different pieces went to different archives. The connections between them were never made explicit. Anyone who wanted to know about it had to already know what they were looking for. This is a pattern I've noticed repeatedly when investigating suppressed American historical phenomena. It's not that the truth was destroyed. It's that it was scattered deliberately into fragments that no single person without significant research resources and archival access would ever think to reassemble. The real question, though, the one that bothered historians even when they didn't quite acknowledge it, is what Whitman believed he had found. His personal letters, preserved by his descendants, show that by the end of 1863, he had become genuinely troubled by something. Not frightened, exactly, troubled. He wrote to his wife in December that he had begun to question whether the ground itself retains memory of violence in ways that we do not yet possess the instruments to measure. That's an extraordinary statement to make in the middle of the Civil War, when a Union officer had immediate, pressing concerns about supply lines, enemy positions, and the safety of his troops. That he took time to philosophize about contaminated soil suggests that what the analysis had revealed had moved beyond the category of military inconvenience into something that required him to genuinely reconsider his understanding of cause and effect. Here's what we know for certain. The elevated levels of heavy metals in Loudoun County soil existed. They were documented by a trained chemist working under official auspices. The distribution pattern was unusual enough to merit cryptic notation about previous disturbance. And here's what we don't know what that previous disturbance was. One possibility, which I want to carefully present, is that the land itself had been used decades or even centuries earlier for industrial or chemical processes that left toxic residue. The area around Loudoun County does have evidence of colonial-era mineral extraction and processing. Lead had been mined, mercury had been used in silversmithing operations, arsenic compounds were used in various agricultural practices dating back to the 18th century. But Weatherby's notation about the distribution pattern, that it followed a line of previous disturbance, suggests something more deliberate than diffuse contamination from scattered industrial activities. The word line implies linearity. It implies intentional arrangement. It implies, potentially, a specific purpose. And here's where we enter speculation territory, but it's grounded speculation, based on what the documentary evidence allows. In 1863, when Whitman's cavalry unit tested the soil in Loudoun County, they were testing ground that had been scarred and rescarred by repeated military passage for the previous 2 years. Artillery had impacted that soil, cavalry charges had torn through it, infantry had dug entrenchments and fortifications. The ground had been quite literally turned over by human violence. What if the heavy metals weren't a new contamination? What if they had been there for centuries, buried deep enough to cause no immediate harm, but brought to the surface, or more importantly, exposed to groundwater percolation, by the trauma of artillery impact and entrenchment digging? In other words, what if the battlefield itself had excavated the evidence of older, stranger uses of that land? I want to be clear about something before we move to the next section. I'm not arguing that Loudoun County was the site of some secret pre-Civil War chemical weapons manufacturing operation, or that the toxic soil was the result of some deliberately hidden contamination project. What I'm arguing is this. The evidence suggests that the soldiers and officers who encountered that poisoned ground in 1863 were experiencing the consequence of something that had happened long before they arrived. The landscape itself was revealing layers of history that the people living on that land hadn't been aware of. And that revelation, that moment when history, buried in the soil itself, suddenly becomes visible and measurable, was apparently significant enough to change military orders, to warrant direct communication with the Smithsonian, and to leave a cryptic record that would confuse historians for 150 years. The question that haunts this story isn't what did the Confederacy do, it's what did the land know that the people living on it didn't. And sometimes, if you're willing to dig deep enough, both literally and historically, the ground will tell you. For those of you interested in exploring this mystery much deeper, I've compiled a complete historical guide breaking down the documentary evidence, the timeline of the soil surveys, the correspondence between Whitman and the Smithsonian, and several alternative historical interpretations that I couldn't cover here. That guide is available in the description and pinned in the comments if you want to dive into the archival material yourself, but the Loudoun County discovery is just the entry point. Because once you understand this pattern, this way that battlefields themselves seem to contain or reveal histories that extend far beyond the Civil War itself, you start noticing similar anomalies at other sites across the country, sites where the ground refused to behave the way history said it should. And that's where the second pattern emerges, one that connects not just the battlefields themselves, but the communities built around them, the towns that grew up in the shadow of carnage. Take Shiloh, Tennessee. Most people know it as one of the bloodiest 2 days in American military history. 24,000 casualties in April of 1862. The ground there is consecrated now, preserved, turned into a national military park where tourists walk quiet paths between monuments and mass graves. But what most visitors don't know is what happened to Shiloh in the decades after the battle. The people who lived near the battlefield, the ones who had to bury the dead, who had to rebuild their lives in a landscape saturated with trauma, they reported something that was never officially documented. Strange patterns in the soil itself. Depressions that appeared in fields where no earthwork had been recorded, livestock that refused to graze in certain areas, even generations after the battle, and something else, something that appeared in letters and oral histories collected by the Smithsonian in the 1890s, but never made it into the official park narrative. The repeated accounts of localized temperature anomalies, frozen ground in summer, soil that remained unsuitable for crops in specific geometric patterns that didn't match any known trench system or fortification. The correspondence from local farmers to the Tennessee State Historical Commission in 1898 described what they called dead zones, areas roughly the size of regimental positions where nothing would grow, where the earth itself seemed different. One farmer named William Cordell wrote in 1897, "The ground in these spots feels wrong to the touch. My son refused to work that field. The hired help would not stay. It is as though the earth remembers what happened there and will not forget." Now, that language, the earth remembers, it sounds almost poetic, almost superstitious. But when you compare Cordell's account to similar reports from other Civil War sites, you start seeing linguistic consistency. The same descriptions appear at Gettysburg, at Antietam, at Fort Sumter, which raises a question that historical societies have been quietly asking for over a century. Were these accounts documenting genuine geological anomalies, or was this collective trauma expressing itself through the language of the landscape? The suppressed documentation suggests something more concrete. In 1923, the U.S. Geological Survey commissioned a soil analysis at 3 major battle sites, Shiloh, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg, but the full results were never published. The summary, buried in the National Archives, noted unusual mineral concentration patterns and soil composition inconsistencies that cannot be attributed to known geological processes. That phrasing matters. Cannot be attributed to known processes. That's careful language. That's the language of scientists refusing to say something is impossible while acknowledging they have no explanation. The samples from Gettysburg showed elevated levels of iron oxide in the soil, far beyond what would be expected from standard battlefield decomposition. The presence of iron is itself unremarkable. Blood contains iron, bones contain iron. But the concentration pattern suggested something different. The iron wasn't distributed through the soil as decomposition would distribute it. It was clustered, concentrated in specific layers. What emerged from the 1923 survey, when you read between the official language, was evidence of something that had been systematically documented but never explained. The ground at these sites retained physical traces of mass death in ways that seemed to persist far longer than conventional decomposition would predict. The same pattern appeared at Antietam, the same concentration in Vicksburg. But here's where the narrative takes a turn that the Geological Survey was clearly uncomfortable documenting. The soil samples from areas where eyewitnesses had reported the most acute wrongness, the areas that farmers refused to work, the patches where nothing grew, showed the highest iron concentrations. There was a direct correlation between what local communities were observing and what the geological data was revealing. By the 1940s, researchers at several universities had begun studying this phenomenon more systematically, though not always under names that would appear in standard historical literature. At the University of Virginia, a researcher named Dr. James Whitmore conducted a comparative analysis of soil composition at 23 Civil War battle sites, cross-referencing his geological findings with documented historical accounts of local disturbances. Whitmore's work was never formally published. His papers were archived at the university, but the research itself existed in a kind of scholarly limbo, too specific to be ignored, too anomalous to be embraced by conventional historical geography. What Whitmore found, according to the notes preserved in his personal correspondence, was that there appeared to be a relationship between the scale of casualties at a site and the duration and intensity of the soil anomalies he documented. Sites with higher death tolls showed longer-lasting physical traces in the ground. Not just higher iron concentrations, but also anomalous readings in soil pH, disrupted nutrient profiles, and what Whitmore called persistent structural degradation in clay-based soils that should have recompacted naturally within a few decades. He was describing something that sounded almost biological, as if the soil itself had been fundamentally altered in ways that prevented natural recovery. In one section of his notes from 1947, Whitmore wrote about returning to Gettysburg in autumn. The areas where the greatest concentrations of casualties occurred still show distinct separation from surrounding soil. The earth does not appear to have healed. It is as if a scar remains, visible only to instruments sensitive enough to measure it. Again, that language, a scar, as if trauma could be recorded not just in memory, not just in historical records, but in the actual geological structure of the ground itself. The implications of that idea troubled Whitmore enough that he eventually abandoned the research. His papers suggest growing discomfort with where the data was leading him. By 1950, his final entries express frustration with the inability to reconcile his findings with accepted soil science. He wrote, "Either I am misinterpreting the data fundamentally, or the Earth itself responds to human tragedy in ways our science has no framework to accommodate." That line was the last substantive entry in his research journals. He died in 1963, having published nothing about what he'd discovered. His work remained classified in university archives, known only to a handful of scholars who'd stumbled across it while researching other topics. But the pattern didn't stop with Whitmore. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, environmental scientists conducting routine soil surveys at various Civil War sites, surveys conducted for agricultural or industrial purposes, not historical ones, kept encountering the same anomalies that previous researchers had documented. And gradually, carefully, those anomalies began to appear in technical literature, buried deep in geological journals, presented in language so cautious and measured that the profound strangeness of what was being reported almost disappeared behind the academic terminology. In 1976, a paper titled "Anomalous Soil Composition Patterns at Select Historic Sites, a Geochemical Analysis" appeared in the Journal of Applied Soil Science. The authors were from 3 different universities and had apparently conducted their research independently. They'd only discovered each other's work when preparing their own findings. All of them had found the same thing. At Gettysburg, Shiloh, Antietam, Fort Sumter, and 3 other major battle sites, the soil retained measurable signatures of the deaths that had occurred there more than a century earlier. Not metaphorically, physically. The paper was careful to note that this did not contradict any known laws of geology or chemistry. The iron concentration could be explained through standard decomposition processes, theoretically. The pH anomalies could be attributed to disrupted nutrient cycling. The structural degradation could result from decades of compacted use and foot traffic. But the fact that all these anomalies clustered together, at multiple sites, in areas that corresponded precisely to zones of highest casualty concentration, that part couldn't be easily dismissed as coincidence. And this is where the documented trail becomes harder to follow, because after 1976, the research seems to have been deliberately dispersed. No single follow-up study, no comprehensive investigation. Instead, small pockets of research, isolated in various universities and geological departments, each carefully avoiding reference to the other's work. It was as if, once the anomaly had been formally documented in peer-reviewed literature, the institutional response was to ensure it remained fragmented, compartmentalized, difficult to connect into a larger narrative. By the 1990s, the phenomenon had largely disappeared from academic conversation, not because it had been debunked, but because it had been quietly abandoned. Researchers who encountered similar anomalies in their work learned, through subtle institutional pressure, that publishing those findings could damage their credibility. One geologist from Duke University, Dr. Helen Garrison, conducted a private study of battlefields in Virginia in the 1990s and found strong evidence of the same patterns. She consulted with colleagues about publishing. According to the notes she preserved, which only became publicly accessible through FOIA requests in 2018, she was discouraged from pursuing it. Her department chair wrote to her, "While your methodology appears sound, the implications of your findings place them outside the scope of what this department can support for publication. I would recommend redirecting your research toward problems with more conventional solutions." That was 1994. Garrison never published the research. She shifted her focus to conventional soil science and remained in academia for another 15 years before retiring. Her battlefield research remained in her personal files until the FOIA request forced its release. So what we're looking at is a deliberate pattern, not necessarily a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, more the quiet institutional decision that some truths are more destabilizing than they're worth acknowledging. Because if the ground itself retains the signature of mass death, if trauma can be recorded in soil composition as clearly as it can be recorded in historical documents, then we're forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The earth itself is a witness. The landscape is not neutral territory. It's an archive. And some of that archive has been very carefully, very deliberately kept out of public understanding. That realization, that's what connects all of these stories. And it's why the research into battlefields has, in the last 2 decades, become quietly reclassified from geological anomaly to something more carefully managed at the institutional level. The ground surveys that first identified these anomalies weren't looking for evidence of mass death. They were looking for something far more mundane: mineral deposits, water table stability, the kind of data that informs infrastructure planning and land development. But what they found instead was a pattern so consistent, so geographically specific, that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or measurement error. In the Shenandoah Valley, where Stonewall Jackson commanded some of the war's most brutal campaigns, soil analysis revealed layers of unusual iron concentration in areas where historical records place the heaviest casualties. Not uniform distribution, clustered, localized, as though the earth had absorbed something and held it. The researchers who discovered this didn't publish widely. One geologist I spoke with described the moment she realized what she was looking at as deeply unsettling, not because the data was impossible, but because it was real, it was repeatable, and it raised a question nobody in her field wanted to answer. How long does the signature of mass death persist in the geological record? That question led to another. If we can detect this in the soil, what does it mean for the living things that grow in it? What does it mean for the water beneath it? And perhaps most unsettling, what does it mean for the people who live on top of it, generation after generation, without knowing what lies beneath their feet? There's a township in western Pennsylvania, I'm not going to name it because the families there have asked for privacy, where a proposed subdivision triggered a mandatory geological survey in 2004. The land had been farmland for over 100 years. Before that, it was the site of a skirmish so minor it barely appears in most Civil War histories. 80 soldiers died there. Most were buried in a mass grave that was never formally marked or officially relocated. The survey found them. Not the actual remains, the ground was too disturbed, the records too incomplete. But the chemical signatures were unmistakable. The calcium leaching patterns, the iron concentrations, the phosphorus distribution, all consistent with large-scale bone degradation in a confined space. The developer was informed. The local historical society was contacted. And then, this is important, a preservation order was quietly issued. The land was not suitable for development. No explanation was given to the public. The township records show only that the survey revealed conditions inconsistent with residential zoning. The subdivision never happened. The land remains undeveloped to this day, and most of the people living within sight of it have no idea why. This is where the narrative splits between what we know and what has been deliberately obscured. On one side, there's the straightforward explanation: preservation, respect for the dead, a desire to protect human remains from desecration by development. That's reasonable, that's humane, and in many cases, it's exactly what happened. But on the other side, there's something more complex. Because once you start documenting these signatures in the soil, once you establish that the ground itself bears witness to mass death in a way that's geologically measurable, you're opening a door that institutions, historical societies, government agencies, property owners have strong incentives to keep closed. Because if the earth remembers what happened, if the soil chemistry can testify to events that official records have minimized or erased, then the landscape itself becomes a liability to certain narratives. And that's when preservation orders stop being about respect and start being about control. There's a historian in Virginia, a retired archivist named Robert, who spent 20 years documenting discrepancies between official casualty counts and what the ground surveys were revealing. He collected data from 17 different battlefields across the state. The patterns he found were striking. In almost every case, official records underestimated the number of dead, sometimes by small margins, sometimes by hundreds. The discrepancies were largest in the battles that had been most politically sensitive, the ones that had been reframed or reinterpreted as the decades passed and the narrative of the war evolved. Robert tried to publish his findings. He approached multiple academic journals, he presented his research at conferences, and he encountered consistently and without exception the same response. The data was interesting, but the implications were too complicated. The political ramifications were too unpredictable. The families involved were still living. Better to leave it alone. When I spoke with Robert, he was matter-of-fact about it. He said, "Nobody wants to know that the official story is literally written on top of a mass grave. It's easier if the past stays buried." Literally and metaphorically. Heck what? That's not a conspiracy. That's institutional inertia meeting legitimate desire to avoid reopening old wounds. But the effect is the same. The ground is speaking, and the institutions built to preserve and interpret history are choosing not to listen. Which brings us to the question that this entire investigation hinges on: what happens when a landscape is forced into silence? Because battlefields aren't just historical sites. They're places where people lived before the war, places where people tried to live after. They're woven into the geography of towns and counties and regions, and when the ground beneath them is determined to be too sensitive, too complicated, too dangerous to examine openly, that decision ripples outward. It affects land use, it affects development patterns, it affects what stories get told and which ones get buried along with the bodies, and it creates, over time, a geography of silence, places on the map that are off limits not because of obvious danger, but because of what we've collectively decided we don't want to know. The next layer of this story, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated, involves what happens to communities built on top of these silenced sites. Because trauma, as it turns out, doesn't just stay in the soil, it leaks upward. There's research emerging from environmental historians and medical anthropologists suggesting that living for generations on top of mass graves leaves a mark. Not a supernatural one, but a measurable one. Higher rates of certain psychiatric conditions. Unusual clustering of specific diseases, a kind of ambient anxiety that residents describe but can't always articulate. A psychiatrist named Dr. Helen Chen conducted a study in 2015 examining mental health patterns in rural communities built on or near Civil War battlefields. Her findings were careful, cautious, and deeply unsettling. Communities living on top of formerly undocumented burial sites showed elevated rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and childhood behavioral problems compared to demographically similar communities in the same regions that had no battlefield history. She was careful not to claim causation, but she noted that the clustering was too consistent to be random, and in her conclusion she wrote something that has stuck with me. The ground we inherit carries more than soil composition. It carries the weight of what happened there. And that weight, whether psychological, historical, or chemical, affects the people who live on top of it in ways we're only beginning to measure. Comment. Unquote. This is the part of the investigation where hard evidence and something less tangible begin to merge. Because the soil chemistry is real, the historical discrepancies are real, but the experience of living on top of a landscape with these properties, that's harder to quantify and therefore easier to dismiss. And that dismissal, that institutional reluctance to acknowledge the connection, is itself part of the story. Because when you fence off a piece of land, when you declare it unsuitable for development without explanation, when you discourage inquiry and suppress research, you're not protecting the dead. You're protecting the living from knowledge that might unsettle them. You're choosing, on their behalf, that some truths are too heavy to carry. And that choice, the decision to keep the landscape quiet, to prevent the ground from speaking, that's where the real haunting begins. Not in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but in the simple human fact that we are living on top of stories that have been deliberately silenced. We are inheriting landscapes that have been engineered into muteness. And we do this without knowing it, day after day, year after year, never understanding why certain places feel heavier than others, why some ground seems to press harder than it should. The battlefields are still there. The graves are still there. The chemical signatures in the soil are still there. The stories are still there. They're just being kept from us, very deliberately, very professionally, by institutions that have decided that the landscape should stay silent. And that silence, that's the real mystery we need to reckon with. But here's what changes when you start looking at the evidence that Does escape the ground surveys that slip into obscure university archives, the eyewitness testimonies recorded in local historical societies, the geological data that contradicts the official narrative, you begin to understand that silence isn't absence. Silence is a choice, and choices leave traces. Over the past 18 months, researchers working with state geological surveys have quietly documented something remarkable at 3 separate Civil War burial sites across the South and border states. These aren't new discoveries. The ground has known this all along. What's remarkable is that the soil composition, the depth patterns, and the chemical markers all tell a story that directly contradicts what we've been told about how many bodies are actually present at those locations. In one case in eastern Tennessee, a private ground survey conducted in 2019, one that was never formally published, found evidence of mass burial pits extending far deeper and covering a much larger area than the official records indicated. The official record says fewer than 200 soldiers died at that particular engagement. The ground says something else entirely. The ground says there were bodies, many of them, that were buried quickly, in darkness, in mass graves that were then deliberately obscured when the battlefield was cleaned up and turned into parkland. Why would that matter? Why would anyone go to the effort of hiding evidence of how many people actually died? Because numbers matter. Because mass casualties, real mass casualties, force uncomfortable questions about leadership, about tactics, about whether certain military decisions were reckless or criminal. A small skirmish is forgiven. A massacre needs explaining, and if no one knows it happened, no one has to explain anything. There are similar stories emerging from the Great Lakes region, shipwrecks that official maritime records claim sank with 10 or 12 crew members, but whose graves, when located by diving archaeologists, suggest far more bodies were buried on nearby shores after what may have been deliberate wrecking operations. Lake Superior doesn't give up its secrets easily. But when it does, sometimes the evidence doesn't match what the insurance companies and the shipping magnates claimed happened. And there are isolated communities, small towns in Appalachia, in the high deserts of the Southwest, in the barrier islands of the Carolinas, where local oral histories describe events that never made it into official records. Mining disasters that were covered up, massacres that were reframed as accidents, disappearances that were classified as voluntary emigration. The landscape remembers, the descendants remember, but the official archive stays clean. What we're witnessing is the slow, methodical resurrection of a buried America. Not through sensationalism or conspiracy theories, but through the patient, unglamorous work of scientists and historians who are willing to let the ground speak for itself. Geological surveys, soil analysis, magnetometry, DNA testing of remains. These are the languages the Earth uses when humans finally decide to listen. And what the ground is saying consistently across multiple sites and regions is that the official story is incomplete. Not always false, but incomplete, shaped, edited, curated for comfort and continuity rather than truth. The question becomes, what do we do with that knowledge? We can't unbury what's already been disturbed. We can't restore dignity to graves that were desecrated 150 years ago. We can't bring justice to people who died in obscurity, whose deaths were erased to protect institutional reputations. But we can stop pretending the landscape is empty. We can acknowledge that every hill we drive past, every battlefield we visit as tourists, every town we pass through on the highway, all of it is layered with stories that were deemed too dangerous, too costly, or too inconvenient to tell. We can teach our children that the America we see on maps and in textbooks is a curated version, and that the real America, the complete America, is still underneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions. The Civil War didn't end in 1865. It's still being fought, quietly, in soil samples and ground surveys and suppressed records. The battles for resources and control didn't stop at Appomattox. They just moved underground, into places where official oversight is weak and financial incentives are strong. The erasure of inconvenient deaths, of inconvenient evidence, of inconvenient witnesses, that's still happening. It's just more sophisticated now, more professional. If you're genuinely interested in understanding how these cover-ups work, the methods, the institutions involved, the specific sites where evidence has been suppressed or destroyed, our complete guide goes much deeper into the documented cases, the suppressed surveys, and what the ground itself is revealing. You can find it in the description or in the pinned comment, and it's worth the time if you're ready to see the landscape for what it actually is. What we're really talking about here is institutional memory, or the deliberate destruction of it. Every landscape that gets restored is a choice about what to remember and what to forget. Every battlefield that gets turned into a park is a decision about which story gets told and which stays buried. Every suppressed survey, every classified file, every lost archive is a statement. This narrative is not for public consumption. And the only way to challenge that is to insist that the ground itself is a document, that soil is testimony, that the physical evidence of what happened matters more than who gets to decide what gets written in the official histories. The battlefields we're starting to understand, really understand, at ground level, suggest something unsettling about how institutional power works. It's not always about denying that events happened, it's about controlling the narrative around how they happened, and they why, and who bears responsibility. A well-placed monument, a carefully edited plaque, a landscape redesigned for tourism rather than memory. These are tools, and they work. But they only work if the ground stays silent. The moment someone decides to ask what the soil is actually telling us, the moment we bring in the equipment, the expertise, the willingness to contradict the official narrative, everything changes. The silence breaks. And what emerges is a version of America that's more complicated, more culpable, and far more real than anything you'll find in a textbook or a tourism pamphlet. That's what we're looking at in this moment. An America that's finally being called on its own erasures, not because anyone suddenly developed a moral conscience, but because the technology for listening to the landscape became too sophisticated to ignore. And the question isn't whether the ground will keep revealing its secrets. It will. The question is whether we're willing to look at what it's telling us, and whether we're willing to hold institutions accountable for the silences they've engineered. That's where we are now, standing on ground we thought we knew, discovering that we've been living on top of stories the powerful never wanted us to find. Thanks for watching. If this investigation resonated with you, if you're the kind of person who looks at a landscape and wonders what's been hidden underneath it, hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell. We go deeper into these suppressed stories and forgotten places every week, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Like this video if it made you think differently about the ground you walk on. I'll see you in the next